I think they're exactly the same forces that have been around for 200 or 300 years. Profit, trade, making sure that companies don't go out of business, making sure you beat the competition, survival, and making as much money as possible. I don't think capitalism has changed in its fundamentals. I think the really big question is not what has changed, but what is threatening it and what is challenging it. And I put the answer in two ways. One is we thought at the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of communism, with the collapse of organized Marxist parties, that capitalism was safe. We called it globalization. We thought the liberal world order was safe, led by the United States. We thought liberal democracy was safe, led by the United States and the European Union. The real big surprise, and it's a black swan which has come along over the last 10 or 15 years, that all of that hubris, that optimism that was there, at least until the 2008 crisis is gone. And the world we're living in now is the challenges that capitalism now confronts. I don't think it's going to be overthrown. I don't think it's about to be replaced. It's not like the 1930s when people believed in 5-year plans, but it is clearly facing a series of major challenges, which I think, frankly, elites, policymakers in whatever country actually don't have an answer to. One of the reasons they don't have an answer is simple. They can no longer work together internationally. The fragmentation of the global system of politics in the world means that any attempt at cooperation to deal with the real questions which are facing the world today, simply cannot be addressed because the world states, the biggest states in the world, particularly China and the United States, are at loggerheads with one another. So we're in a situation where the challenges are rising all the time. Inequality, low growth, lower of living standards, poverty is rising once again around the world. China and the United States are frankly enemies now, even though they don't call each other enemies. We have an ongoing war in Russia, and we've got an upcoming major crisis in the Middle East. These are all going to be great geopolitical challenges, which are going to challenge the economic order. I don't think the economic order is going to be overthrown because nobody's got an alternative to that economic order, but I think that's where we are at the moment.
We know from economic history that changing technologies of work and production are tremendously important in the way in which capitalism works. So throughout history that has been the case. And at the moment we're in the middle of, perhaps at the beginning of an extraordinary revolution in digital technologies, artificial intelligence and so on, which is already making a huge difference. In my area in law, already AI is tremendously important to how law firms are working. So this is going to go on being a challenge, but in terms of how that technology affects our world, it's going to be a question of how well our political institutions can respond to it, can plan around it, can in some ways even ideally anticipate some of its impact. So if we look back to the last big technological revolution, the sort of deindustrialization of the 1970s, we know that political institutions did not deal very well with that. We're still living with the consequences, and some of those consequences have been consequences in terms of creating problems and fractures within our political systems and therefore making our democratic systems less effective. So we've got a big challenge on our hands. I think one of the things that's obvious that we should do in order to create better jobs, good jobs in the newly emerging economy, we need to anticipate what skills people are going to need, and we need to train and retrain people. Education is no longer going to be something you do at the beginning of your life. We're all going to be retraining through the life course. So how well our political institutions can match up to that challenge in the medium term as well as the longer term, I think is probably the key thing.
There are better and worse forms of capitalism. And that what's happened in the last 4 decades is that we've gone from a better to a worse form of that capitalism. And so the two big interconnected questions have clearly been, how did we get here and how do we get into a better world tomorrow? And I think that those two answers are clearly interlinked. How we got here, I think a key answer is that the key people who have won in this kind of new world have really driven the emergence of that world. So that's financial capital and large TNCs. And I think that they've very clearly for the last 4 decades been fighting for the world we see. So low tax centers, incredibly open to speculative capital, low levels of worker protection. And so I think part of the answer for moving to a better world, a better form of capitalism, is in being more open to that conflict. So creating political organizations and political movements that are able to more openly fight within that kind of space of battle and to create kind of better working conditions, minimum tax rates, to address tax havens. So I think, borrowing from our own work and the much better work of Alice Amsden, I think it's important that we discipline capital so that the big push that we see in politics moves to more openly trying to fight for that better world, and that it's not a tinkering of the system or kind of incentives. It's about really addressing at a fundamental level, how do we win back these big gains that we lost?
I believe the answer for both the short and the long term is demographics. Right now, my perspective is very US oriented, but if you look at who's making the decisions in the United States, their parents grew up during World War I and II, and they grew up during the Cold War. They very much believe that there is an outside threat to the United States that they need to tackle, and the best way to do that is through economic strength. The United States, we are widening the gap between us and our European counterparts because we have low taxes and we have an environment that is conducive to economic growth. And so as long as we continue that, we're going to widen the gap between Europe and maintain the gap between us and China, and that is on the forefront of our policymakers' minds. However, in the long term, my generation will take over, and my generation, we look at European countries and we look at them having universal health care and universal education, and we ask ourselves, how is it that we are the most prosperous country in the world, yet we are living paycheck to paycheck, and how we have a student loan crisis, student housing crisis, and a variety of other factors? We no longer need to focus on economic strength because the outside threat does not exist as much in our minds for the people that are currently in power, and we're going to demand from our employers and our government that we want more vacation days, we want higher pay, we want better work-life balance, and we want more welfare institutions. And this can be whether for good or bad. We are going to demand more social policy rather than economic policy.
It's still very much all roads lead to China, but it's going to be a bumpy process now. And more specifically, like right now, China is going through its biggest threat to its own growth model. So we've got demographic change, we've got a debt overhang from real estate, and we've also got the biggest D in this factor, de-risking and decoupling, coming out of pressures with the United States. So what I'm really interested in there is thinking through what that process is going to look like. Because I think many people would argue that those creation of new supply chains is going to lead to high inflationary pressures. And we're already living in a highly inflationary time. And so this is really the moment for capital to step up in many ways, and the incentive structures should align because we've got high prices and new potential profit opportunities. But historically, whenever we've had high inflation, in the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen the Federal Reserve really increase interest rates as we're seeing right now. And so it makes the potential aggregate demand channel that could incentivize business to invest actually get crippled very quickly. And so the real question for how our capitalist as well as geopolitical rivalries are going to unfold is whether or not aggregate demand in the United States stays real.
I think one point that is often unremarked upon is the degree to which the world over the last couple of decades has seen the disarticulation or even the slow disintegration of what had been more or less hegemonic structures of an international order. And these really came about after the Second World War and were very much at that time crafted by the Allies who won the war, in particular the United States and Europe. And then they experienced a crisis in the 1970s on the back of oil shocks, high inflation, the debt crisis, etc. They were sort of retooled in the 80s from Reagan and Thatcher through the Plaza Accords and other things like this, and then really flourished again in the 1990s and 2000s up until about the 2008 crisis. Since then, they haven't worked. And I think what's often not recognized is that they're not coming back. And not only are they not coming back, we're not into another round of hegemonic structures with a singular challenge or one challenger or one set of alternatives. Rather, they're simply fraying and breaking apart. And what comes next is most likely to be some kind of multipolar balance of power, whether that be in terms of the economy, in terms of geopolitics, or indeed in terms of institutions and structures of global governance. And I think once we realize that, we can move beyond sort of lamenting that The US no longer controls 35% of GDP as it did after World War II. No country ever will again, most likely. And that we're no longer in a simple bipolar competition like the Cold War and wondering what to do, and actually start thinking about solutions to some of these very pressing problems.
In the short term, there is no question that mercantilism, state-led industrial policy, and geopolitics will be the major force that shapes capitalism. But what is more interesting to me in the long term is how political leaders in the in the context of developed economies, how political leaders will do and shape state-led industrial policies. So for example, we have seen the United States making legislation such as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or the Inflation Reduction Act. So these state-led industrial policies usually appeal to protectionist voters who don't want to open up their economies to the global world, or who are very anti-trade, if you will. But then again, what a lot of political leaders are trying to do is also appeal to left voters who care about the environment and who care about human rights in China. So if you think about these two groups, pro-security voters and pro-environmental or pro-human rights voters, they don't really work together very well in traditional political sense. So for political leaders in the coming decade, their major task will be to build these unlikely coalitions between the right and the left, and we'll see whether they can embed their state-led industrial policies in this unlikely and unfavorable domestic political environment, if you will.
The main forces to change and enhance capitalism and what it does will come from within, from the constituencies, the customers to be served. Those less well off have not benefited from the current nature of capitalism and how it has evolved. Their voice will be important, but also then the entrepreneurs themselves hearing that voice, I think will help comport the kind of change we aim for. But, and there's always a but, we need our thought leaders, entrepreneurs, influencers, policymakers to help reframe the conversation for nation states about economic well-being, economic benefits for all. That conversation is the right context in which decisions can be better made and help, if we need, to level that playing field.
Firstly, with the role of geopolitics, obviously it's been discussed that we're living through an era of potential deglobalization and changing alliances. And so this will very much affect how the system reflects the changing nature of capitalism with these political changes. And then in the short term, we have, wars that really affect the nature of investment from corporations and on a national scale. Obviously with the Israel-Palestine conflict right now and the Ukraine war, this is changing how nations are approaching capitalism investment, and the same for businesses. And the question is, how are we going to respond to this? Are we going to keep tightening protections and focusing on the national and retreating into economic nationalism, or is there going to be more cooperation through sort of international organizations, which could change this, this changing dynamic? AI is sort of changing the nature of labor and work and investment. And so this could transform capitalism in a way that we can't even conceive of yet. Because we moved from an era of industrial capitalism to one of financial capitalism. And now with AI revolutionizing technology further, this could change the shape of capitalism in a way that we don't even know yet. Climate change, of course, is another important factor which is affecting countries differently, and it's important to think about how we can approach reforming capitalism in a way that can produce equity among different nations, especially the global south, which has sort of faced the brunt of climate change thus far. So I think that will change the nature of investments for companies, for nations, and it will change the nature of how international organizations and how nations interact.
We need to reassure governments who are thinking about experimenting with new technologies, new regulation, that they are not going to risk suffering in a very competitive international environment and potentially do permanent damage to the economies if they get it wrong, but this can only be done through international cooperation. The problem is that today international cooperation is very fragmented. You have many different organizations that have a focus only on a limited range of the share of global problems. We have the World Trade Organization, the International Labour Organization. We have organizations on taxation, on climate change, but these problems are all really connected. So we don't have anything that can create more joined up governance. The G20 is too weak. The EU is only a regional organization. We need to build up our regulation capacity beyond that level.